To Elizabeth Garcia, the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on the track was not the sound of a journey, but the final, ticking beat of the greatest gamble of her life. She had wagered her barren past and her solitary existence on the promises of a strange man in the far west. The small portrait he'd sent showed a kind smile. His letters were filled with warmth and the promise of a home. As the train began to slow, she clutched the crumpled paper in her pocket. This was the moment of judgment. Would she find her paradise, or just another mirage in this unforgiving desert? The shriek of steel wheels on the track finally fell silent, giving way to the bustle of a frontier afternoon. Elizabeth adjusted her bonnet and stepped down from the metal stairs, her heart beating like a young bird's before its first flight. The year was 1878, and after a long journey west, this sun-drenched, dusty land was the destiny upon which she had gambled everything. Her simple calico dress, one of her few worthy possessions, swayed as she set her worn wooden trunk on the ground. Inside it lay her entire world. But her most precious asset was tucked inside her pocket, a carefully folded letter. The handwritten words of a man named Henry had become her guiding lighthouse, promising a home, a sense of belonging she had never known. She scanned the noisy crowd, searching for a face made familiar through description alone, and then she saw him. A tall man standing out from the rough-and-tumble cowboys. His suit was impeccably tailored, his leather boots polished and free of mud, the mark of a successful man. A man of standing. Gathering all her courage, Elizabeth approached, a timid smile on her lips. "Are you Mr. Henry?" she asked, her voice nearly lost in the shouts of the porters. The man turned. His eyes swept over her, from her plain bonnet to the frayed hem of her dress, lingering on the old trunk at her feet. A silence stretched for only a moment, but it was long enough for the air to grow cold. "Miss Elizabeth," he replied, but there was no warmth in his voice. Instead, there was a flicker of surprise, and perhaps a cool calculation. Elizabeth's smile faltered. An instinct, honed by a life of disappointment, told her something was wrong. "Your letters," Henry began, his tone strangely distant. They painted a different picture. Her heart tightened. "Is something the matter, sir?" she managed, trying to keep her voice from trembling. Henry cleared his throat, his gaze hardening. "A marriage is a partnership, Miss Garcia, a consolidation of standing. I was expecting a partner who could contribute to the household I am building, not one who arrives with empty hands." His words were as blunt as a slap. "My reputation in this town was built on tireless effort. I cannot have it compromised." Blood rushed to Elizabeth's face, a hot flush of shame consuming her. She had been honest about her circumstances in her letters, but perhaps he had only read what he wanted to read. She felt so naive. I am sorry if I have disappointed you," she whispered, tears beginning to blur the scene around her. "I came with hands ready to work hard. I believe that." "Belief doesn't build a house, miss," Henry cut in, his voice now entirely cold. He glanced around, noticing the curious stares they were attracting. Pulling a small purse from his pocket, he pressed a few coins into Elizabeth's hand. "This should be enough for a return ticket east, or for whatever else you need to do." It was a dismissal, an act that cruelly terminated everything. Elizabeth stared numbly at the money in her palm. She didn't want his money. She wanted the promise in the letter. "Please," she pleaded in vain, but Henry had already turned his back. With a curt nod in place of a farewell, he strode away, melting into the crowd and disappearing down the dusty streets without a single backward glance. For a long moment, Elizabeth stood frozen on the platform. The world around her carried on, indifferent to the fragments of a broken heart. Families reunited with laughter, new arrivals hurried to find carriages. No one knew that, in just a few short minutes, a woman's entire future had collapsed. "Pardon me, miss, you'll have to step aside." The station master's polite voice pulled Elizabeth from her stupor. She nodded mechanically, gathered her trunk, and shuffled to a wooden bench at the edge of the platform. She sat down, a creeping numbness replacing the initial sharp pain. The western sun still cast its golden rays, but for Elizabeth, the entire world had just turned cold and gray. She was utterly alone. Time passed without meaning. Elizabeth sat on the wooden bench, the world around her a blur of color and muted sound. The afternoon sun was no longer harsh, but had begun its descent, casting long shadows and painting the station in a sorrowful amber. Every family that left with laughter, every carriage that rolled out of town, felt like a knife twisting in her solitude. Return east? Return to what? To the orphanage that had raised her, or to the threadbare boarding house where she had worked tirelessly just to survive? There was nothing behind her and a chasm before her. A single hot tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away hastily, refusing to allow herself to break down in public. She had to be strong, though for what, she did not know. "Miss, are you all right?" The voice was low and gentle, not startling her, but landing like a small pebble on the still surface of her despair. Elizabeth looked up. Standing a few paces away was a man. He wore no suit, no polished leather boots. He was dressed in worn denim work clothes, a heavy sack slung over one shoulder. His features were rugged, his skin weathered by sun and wind, but his hazel eyes shone with a genuine concern not to make himself seem less imposing. He deliberately set the heavy sack on the ground. "I don't mean to pry," he continued, "but I saw what happened. No one deserves to be treated that way." His words, containing no pity but rather an indignation on her behalf, touched something deep within her. The defensive wall Elizabeth had tried to erect suddenly crumbled. A choked sob escaped her lips. Ashamed, she quickly covered her mouth with her hand. The man did not recoil, nor did he seem embarrassed by her tears. Instead, he slowly approached and sat on the same bench, but kept a respectful distance. He removed his hat, revealing sandy-colored hair. "My name's Jacob," he introduced himself, his voice steady. "Jacob Hale. I have a small ranch a few miles from here." He paused, giving her a moment to compose herself, then asked carefully, "Do you need any help, miss?" Elizabeth looked into his eyes, searching for a hint of deceit, but found only a simple sincerity that somehow made her feel safe. "I'm Elizabeth," she replied, her voice still trembling. I came here to be married, but he changed his mind." Admitting it made the pain flare anew, and she looked down at her tightly clasped hands. "I'm truly sorry," Jacob said softly. "Do you have a place to stay now? Any family out west?" She only shook her head. Her silence said everything. Jacob looked at the small figure huddled on the bench, and a look of resolve settled in his eyes. "Listen, Miss Elizabeth," he said, his tone firm but still gentle. "I can't just leave you here. There's a decent boarding house down the road. I can take you there." He hesitated, as if carefully weighing his next words. "Oh, my ranch has plenty of room. It's safe, and probably more comfortable than a crowded boarding house. There's a spare room. It's my sister's when she visits. You're welcome to stay there as long as you need, until you figure things out." Elizabeth was stunned by the offer. In a single afternoon, she had seen the cruelty and the compassion of human nature. To go with a strange man to his ranch was a risk, a breach of all propriety. But to remain in town, alone and penniless, was an even greater danger. Jacob's rugged face and direct gaze gave her a strange sense of trust. It seemed, too, that there was a distant sorrow in his own eyes, as if he understood what it was to be lonely. I don't want to be a bother," she whispered. Jacob shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's no bother at all. Frankly, the ranch is quiet these days. It would be good to have someone else to talk to." He stood up. "At the very least, let me take you there for the night." We can figure everything else out in the morning." After a final moment of hesitation, Elizabeth gave a small nod. "Yes, thank you. You are very kind, Mr. Hale." "Just Jacob," he said, then gently lifted her trunk, his grip firm, as if it weighed nothing at all. "Come on, let's get you out of here before it gets dark." Elizabeth stood, using the bench for support. She followed Jacob through the dusty main street toward his wagon. As they walked, Elizabeth felt the curious gazes of the townspeople, but she held her head high. She had done nothing wrong. Accepting help was not a thing of shame. Jacob helped her onto the wagon and then stored her trunk in the back. Soon, the wagon began to move, leaving the town behind and heading out into the vast prairie. Elizabeth sat in silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant strokes of orange. She didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time in hours, a tiny, fragile glimmer of hope, like the first star of evening, began to shine in the deep darkness of her heart. The wagon creaked along the trail, breaking the stillness of dusk. Elizabeth sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. Occasionally, she stole a glance at the man beside her. In profile, Jacob's face was resolute, his focus on the road ahead. But there was a gentleness about his silence, a peacefulness that slowly calmed her frayed nerves. It was Jacob who spoke first. "That man, Henry," he said, his eyes never leaving the path. "He's a fool. Don't you ever think the fault was yours." The words were not meant as comfort, but as a firm declaration, a defense she didn't know she needed. A quiet warmth spread through her chest. As the wagon crested a gentle rise, he pointed toward a spread of land in the distance. "That's my place," he said, "Sagebrush Hills Ranch." In the twilight glow of orange and purple, a cluster of sturdy buildings, neat fence lines, and a herd of grazing cattle appeared like a peaceful painting. For the first time all day, Elizabeth exhaled a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding an older man with a graying beard. Presumably the foreman emerged from the barn as they arrived. He nodded at Jacob, his eyes looking at Elizabeth with curiosity but not unkindness. "Evenin', Roy," Jacob said. "This is Miss Elizabeth Garcia. She'll be staying with us for a little while." Roy tipped his hat politely. "A pleasure, ma'am." The house was built of solid timber, clean and orderly, but it held the quiet loneliness of a place long without a woman's touch. A great stone hearth dominated the main room, a rifle resting on a rack above it. But Elizabeth also noticed softer details: a vase of dried wildflowers on a windowsill, a rocking chair with a knitted shawl draped over it. These traces told a story of someone who had once been here. The room for her was small and spare, with a sturdy iron bed and a porcelain wash basin. "This was my sister's room," Jacob explained softly. "I hope you'll be comfortable." The next morning, Elizabeth awoke to the crowing of a rooster and the unfamiliar sounds of ranch life. The memory of the previous day rushed back, but she was determined not to dwell on it. She was here not to be a burden. In the kitchen, she found flour, coffee, and bacon. With the deftness of one long used to fending for herself, she set about preparing a hearty breakfast. When Jacob and Roy came in from the cool morning air, they both stopped in surprise, drawn by the welcoming aroma of brewing coffee and frying bacon. "Good morning," Elizabeth said, a shy smile on her lips. "I thought I should at least do something to say thank you." Jacob looked at her, a look of astonishment melting into deep appreciation. "You didn't have to do this, Elizabeth." "But it's wonderful." That breakfast was warm and strangely comfortable. Roy even joked he hadn't eaten this well since Jacob's sister last visited. It was during that meal, as Elizabeth asked about life on the ranch, that Jacob first mentioned his past. "I was married once," he said, his voice lowering, his gaze drifting to his coffee cup. "My wife, Catherine, she passed away almost 2 years ago." Elizabeth reached out, her hand resting gently on his sturdy forearm. A simple, wordless gesture of sympathy. "I'm so sorry," she said sincerely. Jacob gave a small, grateful nod. She was a wonderful woman. He said no more, but Elizabeth understood the wound was still deep. And she understood more about the distant sadness she had seen in his eyes. The days turned into weeks. Elizabeth was no longer a guest. She found her place in the rhythm of the ranch. In the mornings, she tended the small garden and the chickens. In the afternoons, she prepared meals for the men as they worked out on the range. In the evenings, she and Jacob would often sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. In the quiet of those evenings, they shared more. Elizabeth spoke of her childhood in the orphanage, of the years spent working in a textile mill, of the persistent loneliness and the desperate leap of faith in becoming a mail-order bride, just to find a home. Jacob listened, not with pity, but with a quiet respect. When she finished, he shook his head slightly, a look of admiration on his face. "You're a courageous woman," he said. "It takes a strong soul to leave everything behind in search of hope. Henry's loss will be someone else's gain." His words made Elizabeth's heart flutter. She dared not read too much into them, but in the warmth of Jacob's voice and his steady gaze, she felt something more than friendship. A quiet, profound connection was taking root between two lonely souls, like a hardy wildflower pushing its way through the tough prairie soil. The ranch was no longer just a temporary shelter. It was slowly, surprisingly, beginning to feel like home. The summer wore on, blanketing the prairie in a golden haze and turning it into a vast tinderbox. Elizabeth had found a peaceful rhythm in her life at the ranch, a sense of belonging she had never dared to dream of. The affection between her and Jacob, though unspoken, had grown with every shared sunset, as quiet and steady as the old oak tree on the hill. But peace on the frontier is as fragile as a thin sheet of ice in spring. One sweltering August afternoon, as the air hung thick and heavy, Elizabeth sat on the porch mending one of Jacob's work-worn shirts. She noticed an odd orange tint to the sunlight, and a faint, acrid smell drifted on the air. Her mending forgotten, she stood, her heart suddenly beginning to pound. Looking toward the southern horizon, she saw a smudge of dark smoke curling upward, spreading like an ink stain across the brilliant blue sky. At that moment, Jacob came, galloping up from the pasture, urgency in every line of his body. He reined his horse to a sharp halt before the porch, dust swirling around him. "Elizabeth," he called out. "Fire. A big one on the prairie, and the wind is carrying it our way." Those two sentences were all it took. A cold dread shot through Elizabeth, but there was no time for panic. They sprang into action, united by the unspoken understanding of people who rely on each other for survival. "Water," Jacob commanded. "Fill every bucket." Elizabeth ran to the rain barrel and began to haul bucket after bucket, her arms trembling with effort but fueled by adrenaline. She raced back and forth, dousing the wooden walls of the house, the porch, anything that could catch a spark. Meanwhile, Jacob returned from the barn with 2 shovels, thrusting one into her hands. "I'm starting a fire break on the south side," he yelled over the rising wind. A line of bare earth might slow it down. They dug furiously at the edge of the property, scraping away dry grass and topsoil to expose the damp earth beneath. The wind grew stronger, carrying hot air and stinging ash that whipped at their faces. The sky was no longer blue. It had turned a sickly amber. In the distance, a vibrant orange glow flickered, growing larger by the minute. Roy, the foreman, returned with a few men from a neighboring ranch. They quickly herded the most valuable livestock to a wide, overgrazed pasture, hoping it would be safe there. But the fire moved faster than anyone could have imagined. It roared like a freight train, devouring everything in its path. Soon, fiery embers began to rain down like a deadly storm. "Careful," Jacob yelled, throwing Elizabeth a wet handkerchief. "Cover your nose and mouth." And then, the worst happened. A tongue of flame leaped across the firebreak they had worked so desperately to create and caught the southern fence line. The wooden posts went up like torches. Elizabeth watched in horror as an ember landed on the haystack near the barn, and in the blink of an eye, it began to smolder. The fire was surrounding them. "Jacob!" she cried, pointing toward the barn as it began to catch fire. Jacob swore under his breath. He knew the fight was lost. Now it was a race to escape. He ran to the last remaining wagon, beginning to hitch the horse to it. Turning to Elizabeth, his voice hoarse from the smoke, he yelled over the roar of the inferno. "Get inside the house. Grab anything you can't bear to lose." His words were a final command before the world descended into hell. Elizabeth's mind raced. The house, her sanctuary, Jacob's home, everything they had. She had no time to think. She only knew she had to run. Without a second's hesitation, Elizabeth sprinted into the house. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, the smell of acrid smoke burning her nose. The only light was a ghostly orange glow filtering through the windows. First, she ran to her room, dragging her wooden trunk with all her might down the hall. But it wasn't just about her things. She couldn't leave without saving Jacob's most precious memories. She dashed into the living room, grabbing his family portrait from the wall and the small sketch of Catherine from the mantelpiece. They were irreplaceable treasures, the soul of this home. As she turned to leave, a loud crash made her jump. A window shattered from the intense heat, spraying glass across the floor. Startled, Elizabeth stumbled on the corner of a rug and fell hard. A sharp, searing pain shot through her right ankle. She tried to stand, but the ankle gave way, unable to bear her weight. Thick, black smoke began pouring in through the broken window. She coughed violently, her eyes stinging, clutching the portraits to her chest. Panic began to rise. She was trapped. "Elizabeth!" Jacob's voice, hoarse but powerful, cut through the roar of the fire. He suddenly appeared in the doorway, his body a massive silhouette against the raging flames behind him. Seeing her on the floor, he understood instantly. He crossed the smoke-filled room in 3 strides. He quickly pulled his own bandana from his neck and tied it over her nose and mouth to filter the smoke, then bent down and scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Still clutching his treasures, Elizabeth wrapped one arm around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, seeking the only safety left in this hellscape. He carried her out into the open. The heat hit them like a blast furnace. Just as they cleared the porch, a section of the roof collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. He gently set her down near the wagon, then heaved her trunk into the back. He lifted her onto the seat before climbing up to take the reins. One arm wrapped around her waist, holding her steady. "Hold on!" he yelled. The terrified horse bolted forward, and the wagon lurched into motion. They raced away from the burning homestead, following the path the livestock had taken toward the creek in the distance. Behind them, the inferno roared. Elizabeth looked back in horror. The ranch, the place she had come to love, was just a black silhouette against a wall of orange flame. Finally, they reached the shallow creek. The horse splashed through the cool water, and Jacob steered the wagon to a halt on the safety of the opposite bank. For several moments, they sat in silence, gasping for breath. They were safe, but the reality of what they had just lost began to sink in as they watched Sagebrush Hills Ranch be consumed by the fire. Elizabeth turned to Jacob, and only then did she see it. A large, angry burn blistered his left forearm. A gash on his cheek was bleeding. His eyes were fixed on the scene of destruction, his face a mask of shock and grief. "Jacob," she said softly, "you're hurt." He blinked, as if waking from a trance. Without a word, Elizabeth quickly tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat, soaked it in the cool creek water, and gently wrapped it around his burn. Jacob winced, but allowed her to tend to him. Her hands trembled as she then used a damp handkerchief to clean the blood from his cheek. When she was done, he opened his eyes and looked at her. In that moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The roar of the fire, the cries of the cattle, all of it faded away. Elizabeth's face was streaked with soot, but her eyes shone with concern, and with something much deeper. "You came back for me," she whispered, her voice full of awe and gratitude. In the chaos, she was only now truly understanding that he had risked his life for her. Jacob looked directly into her eyes, his voice raspy from the smoke. "Of course I came back," he said, as if there had never been any other choice in the world. "I couldn't do otherwise." In those simple words lay a world, a feeling that had never been spoken. Elizabeth's tears began to fall, tears of relief, of fear, and of an overwhelming love she could no longer deny. Without another word, Jacob carefully drew her into his arms. They held on to each other amidst the devastation, as night began to fall and all that remained of the ranch were glowing embers. The house might be gone. Everything they owned might have turned to ash. But as they clung to each other, they knew they had saved the only thing that truly mattered. They had saved each other. Dawn arrived not with a rosy glow, but with a somber silver-gray light. A gentle rain had fallen during the night, extinguishing the last of the embers and washing the ash from the air, leaving behind a clean, sharp quiet. When the sun finally rose, it illuminated a world transformed. The rolling green pastures were now a silent, blackened landscape. From the remains of the ranch, a few thin columns of smoke still rose mournfully. Leaning on Jacob, her ankle throbbing, Elizabeth hobbled with him across the creek and back to their land. The sight before them took her breath away. The barn was a heap of charred timber. The house they had called home stood like a skeleton, its southern and western walls scorched black, its roof a gaping hole. Jacob stood silently, the pain of his loss etched on his face. But only for a moment. He took a deep breath, the resilience of a man forged by the frontier taking over. "Let's get started," he said, his voice steady, and began to assess what could be salvaged. Before long, they were not alone. The neighbors, alerted by Roy, began to arrive. Wagons appeared on the horizon, carrying lumber, tools, and baskets of food. They came without being asked, because on the frontier, one man's tragedy was a burden shared by all. The power of community transformed the scene of devastation into one of determined resolve. All day, they worked together, clearing debris and reinforcing what was left of the house. Elizabeth, though Jacob insisted she rest, refused to be idle. She hobbled about, cleaning salvaged items, organizing supplies, earning her place with diligence, not with pity. As the sun set, the good neighbors headed home, promising to return in the morning. A tent had been pitched for them. Jacob and Elizabeth sat together on the stone steps of the house, one of the few things left intact, quietly sharing a meal of hot stew from a tin bowl. The chaos had passed, leaving behind an exhausted peace. Jacob insisted on rebandaging Elizabeth's ankle. He knelt before her, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he carefully wrapped the clean cloth around her swollen injury. The simple, tender act of care made her heart ache with affection. When he finished, he looked up at her, and in the dim twilight, Elizabeth held his hand tightly. "Jacob," she began, her voice trembling, "thank you for everything. You saved my life." Tears welled in her eyes again. "When I saw the fire, I was so scared, but I realized losing this house, losing this ranch is heartbreaking. But losing you," her voice broke, "losing you would have been unbearable." Jacob listened, his eyes glowing softly. He reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion, "you will never lose me. I am right here." He held her hand tighter. "The day I met you at the station, I just wanted to help a stranger in trouble. I never imagined that in a few short weeks, that stranger would become the most important person in my life. He looked directly into her eyes, his heart now completely open. When I saw you on the floor of that burning house, I knew I couldn't live in a world without you. I love you, Elizabeth. The words she had secretly longed to hear, spoken so simply and sincerely, were more powerful than any vow. A radiant smile broke through her tears. "Oh, Jacob," she sobbed with joy. "I love you too." He smiled, a true brilliant smile that chased away the last shadows of grief. "I was going to wait for a more perfect time," he said, "but I suppose there is no time more perfect than now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. In the faint moonlight, it gleamed softly. It was a simple, plain gold wedding band, worn with time. Elizabeth recognized it. "This ring," Jacob began, his voice reverent, "belonged to my grandmother and then to Catherine. Before she passed, she made me promise something. She told me not to let sorrow lock my heart away forever. She told me to find happiness again, and to give this ring to the woman who could make me smile again." He looked at Elizabeth, his hazel eyes full of all his love and sincerity. "I believe I have found that woman." He took her left hand. "Elizabeth Garcia, you are the kindest, bravest soul I have ever known. You brought light and laughter back to this house and to my heart. Will you marry me?" A cry of pure joy escaped her lips. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, Jacob." His hand trembled slightly as he slid the golden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Amidst the ashes of the past, a promise for the future had just been sealed. Elizabeth threw her arms around his neck and he held her close. On the steps of a ruined house, under a sky full of stars, they found the only foundation they needed to rebuild everything: their love for each other. News of Jacob Hale's engagement to Elizabeth Garcia spread throughout the region, warming a community still reeling from the fire. Their story, a love forged in hardship and kindness, touched the hearts of the frontier people who valued resilience and decency above all else. Autumn draped the prairie in a cloak of gold and purple. With the tireless help of their neighbors, the Sagebrush Hills Ranch rose again. A new barn stood tall, fences were mended, and brave shoots of new grass pushed through the blackened soil. Along with the rebirth of the land came the preparations for a wedding. They decided on a simple ceremony right at the ranch, on the small hill under the shade of the great oak tree, the same tree that watched over the resting place of Catherine, Jacob's late wife. To Jacob, it was a way of including her memory as a peaceful, approving presence. To Elizabeth, with her deep empathy, it felt perfectly right. On the wedding day, the air was crisp and the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Friends and neighbors had transformed the space under the oak into a makeshift chapel. An arch of supple willow branches was decorated with cream-colored ribbons. Rough-hewn benches were set in neat rows. Everything was simple, but made with love. Inside the mended house, Elizabeth looked at her reflection. She wore a lovely cream-colored linen wedding dress, loaned to her by a neighbor's daughter. It was not silk or satin, but to her, it was the most beautiful gown in the world. Her dark hair was pinned up, adorned with a few small sprigs of wildflowers. The woman in the mirror was not the scared, lonely girl from the train station. This was a woman who was loved, her face radiant. With happiness. Outside, Jacob waited under the oak, his heart filled with a peaceful anticipation. He wore his finest suit, a garment that held memories of the past but was now ready to make new ones. Roy stood beside him, fussing over his collar like a proud father. Then, the moment came. Elizabeth began her walk down the aisle of scattered petals. As soon as her eyes met Jacob's, the world around them disappeared. She saw only him, the man who had saved her, looking at her with all the love in his heart. Unable to wait another moment, Jacob stepped forward, breaking with formality to meet her halfway down the path. He tenderly offered her his arm, and she gratefully took it. Together, they walked toward the arched dot. As they passed the small gathering, Elizabeth's eyes caught a fleeting glimpse of a familiar figure standing in the distance, near the edge of the property. It was Henry. He stood with his hat in his hands, his head slightly bowed. Their eyes met for a brief second. There was no anger in her heart, no pain, only a quiet sense of peace. That chapter was long closed. His rejection, ironically, had been the greatest gift fate had ever given her. She smiled at Jacob and completely forgot the other man was there. Under the arch, before their friends, they exchanged their vows. Jacob's voice was deep and steady as he promised to cherish and protect her for all his days. Elizabeth's voice was clear and strong as she promised to love and stand by him through all of life's trials. He gently slid the golden ring, the promise from the ashes, onto her finger. "You may kiss the bride," the traveling preacher announced with a joyful smile. Jacob tenderly cupped Elizabeth's face and gave her a sweet, lingering kiss, sealing their vows. Cheers and applause erupted from the small crowd. The celebration that followed was a true community feast. Long tables were laden with food brought by everyone. A fiddler struck up a cheerful tune, and soon there was dancing. Jacob swept Elizabeth into his arms for their first dance as husband and wife. They laughed, their steps clumsy in the dust, their hearts beating as one dot as Roy raised a glass for a toast, wishing their love to be as endless as the prairie. Elizabeth squeezed Jacob's hand. She looked at the smiling faces around her. Neighbors, her friends, her family. Her heart overflowed with a profound gratitude. From a woman who had nothing, she now had everything. As the last of the guests departed, their wagon lanterns bobbing and disappearing into the prairie night, a peaceful quiet settled over the ranch. Roy was the last to leave. He gave Jacob a firm handshake and Elizabeth a warm, fatherly hug. "You to be happy now," he said, a broad grin on his face. "Be good to see this place filled with the laughter of little ones soon." He gave a playful wink, making Elizabeth blush and Jacob chuckle. At last, they were alone. The house, though still bearing the scars of the fire, felt wonderfully cozy under the light of a nearly full moon. The lingering scent of baked pie and wood smoke hung pleasantly in the air. Jacob led Elizabeth to the front porch, where he had placed 2 rocking chairs side by side. He had salvaged one from the fire and borrowed another, determined that their wedding day would end with a moment of peace under the stars. They sat down, still in their wedding clothes, too full of the day's emotion to think of changing or sleeping. Elizabeth rested her head on Jacob's shoulder, and they rocked in a gentle, synchronous rhythm. The vast western sky stretched above them, glittering with 1,000 tiny diamonds. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the distant call of a nightjar. "I never dared to dream," Elizabeth murmured, her voice a soft whisper in the night, "that when I came west, I would find all of this. A home, a family." Jacob gently kissed the top of her head. "Neither did I," he replied, his voice low and warm. "Sometimes life has to show us the bitter, so we know how to treasure the sweet when it comes. I thought my heart would always be a winter land, and then you arrived." Elizabeth looked up at him, the moonlight soft on her face. She thought of the strange path that had led her here, of the cruel rejection that had once shattered her, but which now seemed like a disguised blessing. Without that pain, she would never have known this kindness. Without that despair, she would never have found this love. Jacob turned to her, his eyes shining with a deep and steady love. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and the new name was a song, sending a warm thrill through her. "Welcome home." Tears of happiness welled in her eyes. Elizabeth smiled, a radiant, contented smile. "I am home," she whispered back and leaned up to kiss and dot in each other's arms. Under the boundless western sky, Jacob and Elizabeth knew their journey was complete. From the fragments of hope, from the ashes of devastation, They had built a love that would endure. And as the prairie wind whispered through the grasses, it carried a simple promise that a love born from embers would forever light their way.